Today we're going to work on revisiting a project that I started a few months ago. I downloaded the pattern for No Match Stars on the Urban Elements webpage. The pattern has several different pages and it also includes a variety of sizes. You could either make the 8-inch block or the 12-inch block. I made the 12-inch block previously and I have several of those blocks completed, but I never did anything with them. And then I found out that Urban Elements has a good supply of these beautiful cake stacks with the batik fabric. I love batik because it sews so beautifully, it cuts really crisp, and it really irons really well. And I have leftover fabric for the background, so I'm going to go ahead and make an equal number of blocks to the blocks that I made previously. I had 16 here. I'm going to make 16 new blocks with these beautiful new batik colors. I'm going to continue using the same background fabric that I had. It was a light batik fabric in shades of purple, a little bit of blue. There really wasn't much green, but I love purple and green together. But I think it's going to match beautifully with this cake stack. So I'm going to take you upstairs, and while you're up there, I hope you'll mind your manners and not notice too much of the messy room, because my upstairs studio is not as clean as it is down here. I'm going to try and keep it off camera. But while we're on the topic of the videos, I do want to take a moment and thank Urban Elements for the opportunity to be presenting these videos for you. Week after week, we brought you free videos. They supply me with fabric or patterns or with ideas, and it's been a pleasure for me to be able to, in isolation, come to you and present free video content. So we hope that you also appreciate that, appreciate Urban Elements for making that contribution and making all things possible, which they have. So I'm going to go ahead and move the camera upstairs, and I'm going to get started on showing you how to cut these pieces, because it's a little bit different from the instructions, and we'll talk about that upstairs, and we'll get started on the pattern. But also, I just wanted to give you a sneak peek. This is a real simple kind of rail fence quilt that I'm going to be playing with next when I get to the strips. That won't be in this video, but we do have the 2.5-inch strips available in the same batik collection, and I'm going to be converting that into this pattern. And this actually makes a really good kids project, you know, between 10 and 16 years old, that they could make for their first quilt. So that will be at a later video. We're going to go upstairs today and talk about these, some of the cutting instructions and ironing, and we'll get this onto the sewing machine. Well, we're going to see how good you are at paying attention to my fabric and not my messy room. One of the things that I love to do when I start a project is pull out my fabric. I love to get it on the ironing board and give it a fresh iron. I'm not really crazy about ironing clothes, but ironing fabric to me is a whole different ball of wax. There's something so personal and revealing about the fabric at this stage. I really think it's where I fall in love with the fabric again. And just as a personal preference, I always wash all of my yard goods as soon as I get them. Now, as a caveat, I would not do that with strips or with the cake stacks because they're too small, even though I have done that in the past, but very carefully hand washing them. But I would iron fabric. Fabric that has been laundered and pulled out of the dryer, if you just went ahead and cut it without ironing it, you could see an increase in the pieces upwards of 1/2 inch, depending on what size you cut it, simply because of little tiny micro pleats in the fabric where it's not completely smooth. ironing the fabric like this really gives you the most precise measurement when cutting, and I just find it's where I fall in love with the pattern again. The pattern and the color. I mean, to me right now, as I look at this fabric, it's mesmerizing. It's almost intoxicating. I am in love with this batik. And I always iron it, as you see, fully open. I don't like to iron folded pieces because I don't want to iron a crease in there that's going to be hard later for me to get out. And I'm just using Best Press in my sprayer. I like a little bit of starch in there, whatever they use in the Best Press, just to help give you that really crisp finish as you're cutting. So I've got this piece ironed as much as I'm going to need of it, and now I'm going to fold it in half, but without ironing it, and put it on the cutting table and cut some of my strip. As many of you know, using a rotary cutter is a three-part system. We have the rotary cutter itself, which is basically a round razor blade. Looks like a little pizza wheel, but it's a lot sharper than that. This will cut through the leather in your shoes, so we always keep the shield closed. If you were to leave it open and put things on top of it, you could cut your fingers. Also, if it were to slide off the edge of the table open, it would cut through somebody's shoe, somebody's jeans, could cut through the carpet, could cut a hole in the wood. So be careful with the rotary cutter. Then we have a special ruler that's designed to work with the rotary cutter, and we have a self-healing mat. It's always a three-part system for getting that work done, but it allows you to have really clean cuts. And the first thing I'm going to do, I have my fabric folded over on itself. I have the open edge towards the top away from me, so that when the blade is moving, if there's any little pleat in the fabric or ease, it can ease out without creating a pucker. And I have the fold towards me. I'm using the fold on one of the lines of the mat to help me get my first cut, and then I'm going to do a clean cut here at the beginning. I'm aligning both the lines of the ruler with the lines of the table to give myself a really precise cut at the start. And then this is waist. I've already determined that I need 4-inch strips for both these cornerstones on the block, but also for the pieces that attach to the star points. These are 4-inch squares, so I'll do 4-inch strips for those and subcut into 4 inches. These are 4 inches by 5.5 inches, so I'll also do 4-inch strips and subcut those into 5.5-inch sections. I've determined how many strips I need in total. I need 8 strips, but I already have 4 that are already cut. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 4 more strips that are 4 inches, and I'm flipping this ruler over because it has a 1/2 inch addition at the end, and I just want to use the 4-inch mark. So I'm going to go ahead and line up 4 inches, and I always seem to want to tap on my ruler. I have a firm grip on my ruler, so when I rotary cut, the ruler doesn't slip. I'm kind of lucky because I'm tall, and I don't have a problem doing a full strip like that. So again, I have the 4-inch marking. I can count my 4 strips again, 4 inches, before I open my rotary cutter. I'm going to move those strips out of the way so they don't become a casualty, and I'm going to cut. So that's 6 strips. I only need 2 more. At this point, I know I have a good 45-degree angle here, and I'm going to show you something a little different. I'm going to take this off of the grid of my rotary cutter mat. I'm still going to use the 4-inch mark on my ruler to make sure that I get those exactly on the 4-inch mark, and I'm going to cut. And the reason I do this sometimes is to spare the mat. If you're continually cutting on these lines on the mat, eventually, even though it's a self-healing mat, you're going to develop a rut on those lines, and it will diminish the longevity of your rotary cutting mat. By slightly switching that up and doing a slightly different angle, my mat has a chance to live a longer life, because the self-healing direction is going in different ways, and it just seems to last a little bit longer. So that's all the strips that I need for the background. The entire 16 blocks for this quilt will come out of these 8 strips. Next, I'm going to subcut these into the 2 sections. When I found this beautiful batik fabric, they had it in 3 different colorways. They had this kind of beigey purple, then they had this green and purple, and then they had a blue version. I wasn't as crazy about the blue version, but I did pick up this green. In fact, I bought it twice because I loved it so much. So I think we can pretty rest assured that this will be the border fabric for this completed quilt when it's finished, at which point it will have 32 blocks. I only need 2 strips of the 4-inch wide to give me enough blocks to do the 16 cornerstones in this No Match Star quilt block. So I have my 2 strips. They're already cut 4 inches wide. I'm going to subcut these into 4-inch sections. I haven't unfolded this fabric because I don't really need to. I'm going to first do a clean cut at the beginning. The fold wasn't perfect, so there's a little bit of overlap there. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that to start. And now I'm just going to go across again and do my 4-inch cut. So that's 1 block there. Rusty would probably laugh if she was here because I did my math wrong. I needed 6 full strips to get my all my squares out of. So I have these layered up, and I'm going to have to remove some. Let's see, I did 2 strips already, and I have 3 here. So I only need 4 more to get my strips cut out of. But the bottom line is, on this, I'm making this many strips because I'm making 16 blocks. However many blocks you're going to make, you're going to need to do the math of that yourself. Also, the pattern does have really good instructions, but the pattern was designed using fat quarters. Also, the pattern was designed so that the background fabric and the star fabric all mixes up together, so that when you see the finished quilt, they just are lights and darks, and they use some of the leftover pieces in the border. I'm switching it up to be able to use my cake stacks and my background fabric all as a whole. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting up these squares, and then I'll move on to cutting up the components for the 4 star points, the background for that. I'm glad my phone had a calculator on it. That way I didn't have to take my shoes off. I have all of my strip sets cut. They're 4 inches wide, but these need to be in 5.5-inch sections. Those are going to be this component here of the background of the star points. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those at 5.5 inches. I should get 4. Now these are folded in half. I have the open end here, and they are stacked 2 sets per stack. So I'm going to very carefully line that up. I've just cleaned off the edges. And now I'm going to use that 1/2 inch addition on my ruler. So when I line this up to the 5 inch mark, it includes the 1/2 inch there. It's funny, the sound of the fingernails on the board just brings me back to quilting. I remember teachers that I've had, people that I've worked with. It's just a sound I'm familiar with, and it's kind of a comforting sound. Kind of an odd thing to think about, I suppose, but it is a memory. And these are going to be tight. Any of these that don't quite come out, though, I can unfold and make sure I have a clean cut on them. And I also have 1 extra strip that I'm going to cut to make sure if I have any pieces that don't quite come up to snuff, that I'll have extras on. So basically these were cut in sets of 4, so each stack basically is 1 block. So I have all of my star point blocks ready, and now what I need to cut are, this was the background, I need to start cutting my cake stack. And I'll show you how I cut that. I probably won't be using all of these, and I believe we get 2 of each color. So I'm going to be choosing the ones that I like best with my background fabric, certainly the purples and greens, but I'm going to include some of these blues as well. They provide a nice contrast. So I'm going to get those ironed, again, nice and crisp, and we'll show you how we cut those up. I'm going to be using my cake stacks to create the colorful stars in the quilt. All of my background is going to be the same light lavender, and then all of my stars will be made out of these blocks. So there are cutting instructions in here for using fat quarters, but as I said, I'm going to be using these beautiful cake stacks from Elementz. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be cutting up a bunch of them like this, 3-inch strips, and then subcutting them into 3-inch squares, and then I'll just have a little inch left over on the side that will be waste. That'll be 9 inches by 9, and the squares are 10 by 10. So we'll get plenty of those, and then on some of the, I need at least 16 of these. So I have 1 5.5 inch square out of the corner of each one, and then I can still get some 5 remaining 3 by 3 squares out of those, so there won't be much waste on those. But I may need more than just 1 packet of these. I do have additional cake stacks that I could supplement my purples and greens, but because I have both stacks, I'm just going to use both of those. So I'm going to show you how to cut the first squares, 3-inch squares, and then we'll do some of the 5.5-inch squares. Without trying to move this too much, I've got 6 pieces of fabric stacked up there. I'm just going to trim off this edge, and now I'm going to do 3-inch strips. And I always like to count with my rotary cutter as I'm cutting, just to make sure. Now I've closed my rotary cutter, and I could just come around to this side if I wanted to and do my subcuts. And I hope I'm not blocking with my shoulder. One, two, three. And there I have a bunch of these star points cut. And then the whole point about this pattern, the reason it's called no match, is because these star points don't extend all the way out into the selvage of the block. There's space in between, and that gives you all kinds of giveaway on the block. So if these were cut slightly irregular, in the end it wouldn't matter, because we're just using them as a point of reference. And if some of the star tips were slightly smaller than others, it would only add to the unique interest of this block. But I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting up these strips, these squares, to do the pattern, and then we'll move on to getting some of the 5.5 inch centers. All of my cutting is basically based on the size of quilt that I wanted to make. Again, there's cutting instructions on here for doing fat quarters. You can download this pattern on the Urban Elements website. I wanted to select fabrics that sort of matched what I had already made. So there were some of the pieces of fabric that I didn't use. Some of these I thought were just a little too light to show up against the background. So I didn't use all of the ones in my cake stack, but also I opened up a second cake stack to get the quantity that I needed for my size. But what I'm going to do next is just show you how I got my 5.5 inch center squares. And I have several of these stacked up, and I'm just going to do a fresh cut at the beginning. And now I'm going to do a 5.5 inch strip. Helps if I wouldn't move the ruler. That I'm going to save for another project. Then I'm going to rotate this around, do a fresh cut at the beginning. Line up my 5.5 inch mark again. Again, I'm going to save these pieces for applique or for another project. And then I have all of these ready to go for squares. Those will be the center square of the block. And I'm going to go ahead and finish subcutting the rest of these 4 units, and I'll have everything cut to start sewing the block. Okay, this is all of the pieces that I need. These will be the outside corner squares. This pile will be the background of the star points. These are all of the star points, and these units here will be the center of each of the star. I made mine similar to this, but mine aren't all going to be solid. I usually like to do a contrast of the center block one color and then the points a different color. That's a little bit scrappy. And these are my leftovers. This leftover fabric, I could come back and do a small inner border with those squares if I wanted to, but I also do have the green fabric for my outer border, so I'm not real concerned. I can save that for another project or in case I make a mistake, but I will probably be alternating the stars and the centers of the block. You could do this completely scrappy and have each star point a different color of fabric, and have the centers different colors as well. And if you did that, you may not have had to cut up as many fabrics, because you can see I had some leftovers. We could have just added in more fabric and really swapped it up. So I've got all my cutting done. Now it's up to sewing. Well, last night after I finished doing all my cutting, I took all my squares in the house, and while I was eating my dinner, I went ahead and made little marks from corner to corner. I just used my Bowen chalk marker. On a couple of them they were a little bit lighter, so I used just a lead pencil because that's going to get cut off anyway. But as you can see, I have all of my components for 16 blocks here in these two piles. But I wanted to remember to tell you, because I just got an update on it, that the cake stacks and the strip packs, the 2.5-inch strips, both of these are from Island Batiks, and we have limited quantities on both of these. Originally they were $42.95, and as long as we have supplies last, we're marking these down to $30. So if you're interested in these, I would order them right away while we still have the quantities that you need. As I said earlier, yesterday, I am going to be showing another quilt in the next video using the 2.5-inch strips, and it's a fairly easy one that kids could work on, 9, 10, up to 16. I mean, any age after that could work on them. But it's a fairly simple quilt, so that will be the next video. But I have everything I need here to get started on the sewing machine, so I'm going to go zip over there and readjust the camera, and we'll get started on the next step. The vast majority of the sewing on this block will be these rectangular units here. Looks like a flying geese. It's also the star points. So that's what we're going to be working on first. That's all I need is my 4-inch by 5.5-inch rectangle background pieces. I have those here, and all of my star points. So what we're going to do is just take one of the star point fabrics, and I already marked mine, which you won't be able to see at that distance, from corner to corner. And I'm just going to position that right on top of my batik rectangle. Now, because these are batik, I don't have to worry about wrong side or right side. They're all right side. But I'm just going to sew directly from this corner directly to that corner, and I've made a straight line, and I'm going to sew directly on that line. When I'm finished, I will measure over 1/4 of an inch away and then trim that piece off. One of the things I also did to get my machine ready, I put on my straight stitch plate. The regular stitch plate has a wide opening here which would allow for a zigzag stitch from side to side. But I'm not going to be doing anything except straight stitching today. But because I'm starting on edges of units, I don't want the fabric to get pushed down in the corner. So I put on my straight stitch plate. And all I have to do, I already have a little piece of fabric started out. I'm just going to lift that up enough to be able to get one unit under there. And I'm just going to sew directly on the line that I created. But these blocks are so small that really you could effectively just eyeball that if that's how you roll. But one other thing I want to keep track of, because of how I'm making my squares, I want all of my star points to be the same color, and that means that I'm going to have to divide these up to make sure that I have enough for both sides. If I just kept sewing these to a unit, then I would only have half of the unit with this particular fabric in it, and I don't want that. I want them all to match. So I'm going to take half of mine and set them aside so that when I'm done trimming these and ironing them, I have the other portion I need for the other half. So I'm going to do that now before I forget. Okay, I've separated aside my squares that will be for the other side of each one of these rectangles, and I've drawn the camera in really close so you can see I've got the edges lined up here, and I'm sewing point to point. I have a faint little chalk line there, and I'm doing what is called chain piecing, which is basically not having any space in between these units. Each one of them is linked. Rather than pulling each piece out and cutting the thread, this chain piecing just allows me to process through assembly line fashion each of these units without wasting a lot of my bobbin thread and top thread. It just saves time rewinding the bobbin, and it saves the thread, which we all know is expensive. As you can see, I have all these units finished. There's 4 and 4. That's enough for me to do the star points for 2 blocks. After I get them sewn, I always snip them apart, and I just like to hit them with the hot iron just before I do any trimming. I've never actually noticed any difference from this, but I've always been taught that giving it an iron on top sets the seams, which seems to make sense to me. So now I'm going to put a rotary cutting ruler on here and cut 1/4 of an inch away, and then I'll have my seam allowance built in, and I can come back and iron these out. So I'm going to go ahead and rotary cut those, and we'll move to the next step. As you can see, I went ahead and trimmed off this excess piece on each of my units, so I left a good 1/4 inch seam allowance. And for those of you who are curious, if you happen to do an additional seam line and iron that out, you'll end up with about a 2-inch square that you could use at your discretion. I just thought I would tell you that because I know there's always somebody who wants to know. But what we want to do is press the fabric out. And I always like to make sure I don't get any little accordion pleats in there. And it is important that we do this step before we add on the next unit. Otherwise, the seam allowance would get caught up if we try to do both of our square points first and then cut it and iron it. You would have the fabric get all caught up in itself. If you did sew all together all of these cut off scraps, you'd end up with about 64 2-inch hash-square triangle units, which you might be able to use for something. You could probably use it as an inner border on one side of a quilt or something, or you could just put it in your scrap box. Next thing I'm going to do is put another one of my Batik triangles. This time I want it coming towards the point here. Again, I have these pieces lightly marked with chalk, and I'm just going to position them on there and start sewing those as well. I really like using that straight stitch plate because it really helps prevent fabric from getting pushed down into the throat of the machine, especially when you're working with little points. After I get these 8 units done, I will have the star points for 2 blocks. It actually feels kind of funny to sit down and sew at the machine because it seems going to snip apart my chain piecing and get the top stitching, setting the seams done with the iron, and then I'm going to trim off at a 1/4 inch mark on each of these pieces, and we'll show you what our units look like. We have all of the units trimmed off, and now I'm going to do the same again. I'm going to iron that the start point out away from the rectangle. I'm going to do that with all of my units. That's 4, that's enough for one block. Now we can go ahead and pretty much visually assemble one of the blocks. And I'm just going to choose a center square. And there we have our star block. So what I'm going to do is just sew these together in units. I'll come back and add these pieces to the unit, and then I'll add these pieces to the unit, and we'll have a completed star block. And after you're finished, you can trim these off, if you have any little excess on any of the pieces. But why this is called no match stars is because the star points don't extend all the way out into the selvage or the seam allowance of the fabric. So you always keep really nice crisp star points even if your piecing isn't at a professional level, and mine almost never is. So this is a really great pattern, and again the pattern's free on the Urban Elementz website. If you just go to the patterns, you can put in mix match star and this will come up. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these into units, and we'll get to show you what the finished block looks like. When you're sewing together the star point unit onto the square background, you can see that the 2 previous seam lines here, which are in white, intersect the black line, which is the new, adding a star point unit to the square block. That should intersect to create 3 lines at one point. If you do that, you'll get a really good sharp, valley, I suppose you'd call that, inside. Okay, we have one block complete. This is from the Island Batiks fat stacks, cake stack squares, and we also have them available in the 2.5-inch strips. Again, both of those are on sale for $30, marked down from $42.95 until quantities run out. So this was ones that I made now. These are the ones I previously made, so I think they're all going to work together fairly well. I'm going to continue working on these. I think I've got 15 more blocks to go for this set, and I'm going to try and get these all finished before I do the next quilt with the strips.